everybody's tuned in and you have your drink, and welcome to Green Drinks, everyone. My name is Katie Breckheimer and I am the host of Green Drinks, and I am joined tonight by Susan Bean, who is a staff person at Mountain True, and Tony Dunn, who is our speaker tonight, and I'm going to introduce Tony in just a minute. But first I wanted to let Susan kind of talk a little bit about our webinar format and this Zoom that we're all probably getting pretty used to by now, but she's gonna get us up to speed.
Yeah, so welcome everyone on behalf of Mountain True. This is a Zoom webinar, which means that you all are here as attendees and you are muted and you are hidden. So your video is not visible to the rest of us, just the panelists are who we can see. And if you scroll your mouse around on the screen, a menu should pop up. For me, it comes up on the bottom. For some people, it shows up on the top with some icons on it. And one of those is a Q&A icon. And if you click on that, there is an opportunity for you to be able to type in questions that you have for Tony as he presents. We will take questions at the end of his presentation. So he will present for about 45 minutes. And then if you have added questions into that Q&A feature during that time, then I will raise those questions to Tony and he can field them. So feel free to type questions in anytime, and that's how you can do that. And then I think that's about it, really.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Well, the plan this evening is for me to talk a little bit about who we are and what's coming up. And then I will introduce Tony to talk about his experience with the Camp Fire, which devastated his community in Paradise, California 2 years ago. And while Tony's presenting, again, I just want to mention that we would prefer your questions and answers at the end, but you can certainly type them in at any time while you're thinking about them. But Tony's going to run through his presentation and then we'll do the questions at the end. So thanks everybody for participating. We're glad you're here. Green Drinks is sponsored by Mountain True and Conserving Carolina. Because of COVID-19, we're going to continue our online presentations through December. So I'm really bummed that we're not getting together, because that's one of the best parts for me, is the community part of Green Drinks. But it's also a wonderful environmental education format, and I love that. So we've got some great speakers coming up, and I'll tell you in just a minute. So Green Drinks is actually an international movement. There are 500 chapters. We are one of them, and people get together all over the world and have conversations about the environment. And some places have speakers, some just get together and network, but we always have a speaker, and that's one of the great things about how it goes where we are. Before we begin, I want to tell you a little bit about our upcoming speakers. On September 10th, we have Hume Davenport. He's the founder of the nonprofit South Wings, I guess it is. And he'll talk about how they assist environmental organizations by taking them up in small airplanes. And they're looking at environmental issues from the top down. And we don't really see what goes on in certain locations as we're driving by or walking by, but you get up in a small plane and you can see an operation from an entirely different angle. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Hume. On October 8th, author Danny Bernstein will be introducing her new book about DuPont State Recreational Forest. Last year, we had Sarah Landry come. She is the executive director of the Friends of DuPont State Forest, and it was very popular. We had a lot of people come for that one, and it was really interesting. And Danny's gonna be talking about how she put that great story into a book form of how DuPont came to be in public hands. On November 12th, we are hosting the French Broad River keeper, Hartwell Carson, who will report on the state of the river. let's see. So Mountain True is part of the Riverkeeper, I guess it's the Waterkeeper Alliance. And we house 4 riverkeepers. We have a Broad Riverkeeper, a Green Riverkeeper, a Watauga Riverkeeper, as well as a French Broad Riverkeeper. And these people are watching out for the river, and they are taking care of all of us as far as our relationship to clean water and our rivers. So November is Hartwell Carson. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening, Tony Dunn. I can't think of anyone more qualified to talk about our topic tonight than Tony. He's a former firefighter, a fire ecologist, a fire behavior analyst, and endangered species botanist with the U.S. Forest Service in California. Tony and his wife lost their home in the 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise, California, and relocated to North Carolina in July of 2019. He and his wife are true climate refugees, and he's going to tell us about it. Thanks, Tony.
All right, thank you very much. This presentation is, I'm going to talk about climate change and how it's affecting our communities, devastating our communities, and specifically, I'm going to talk about what happened in Paradise. But I really want you to understand that what happened there is happening in other places, places like Mexico Beach, Florida, Puerto Rico, anywhere that climate-driven disasters are occurring. And also, it's not just the major disasters. Climate change overall is having these kinds of effects in all communities. And that's really one of the takeaways that I'd like everybody to understand, is that even if it isn't a huge wildfire or a major hurricane, the changes that climate change is bringing to all communities are going to impact us all. And so what this presentation is about really is what really happens to the people and communities impacted by climate-driven disasters. These things like the Camp Fire and the hurricanes, they make the news. They're on the news for a few days or a week or two. And then, the satellite trucks go away and everybody moves on to something else. But these disasters don't stop for the people who are impacted by them. And these impacts never stop for them. And that's one of the things I want people to be aware of, is that they really don't, the impacts never go away. And I want to talk about some of the often insurmountable challenges that these people and communities face on the so-called road to recovery. And that's really a misnomer, because there really is no recovery. You can start over maybe with a different life or a different community or whatever. But there's really no recovery, implies going back to normal. And there's really no going back with these kind of climate-driven things. The other thing that a couple other things I really want to talk about is how vulnerable communities are hit particularly hard. Certainly, since the murder of George Floyd, we've had a lot of conversations about equity and social justice and vulnerable communities and how they're treated. And climate change is no different than systemic racism. It hits vulnerable communities particularly hard. The other thing about climate change is that it makes all of us part of vulnerable communities. And that's something that I really would like everybody to understand, that it isn't just the poor or the elderly or minorities that are impacted by climate change. Ultimately, climate change impacts everyone. So that's really what I kind of want to take away. Katie did a good job introducing me, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. That's me in a Smokey the Bear costume. On July 4th, 1985, I got to be Smokey the Bear at the 4th of July parade in Pine Valley, California. It was about 100 degrees. It was about 150 inside the suit. So that was not the most pleasant experience I ever had with the Forest Service, but I did get to be Smokey the Bear. As Katie said, I've had a number of roles with the Forest Service. I also have had quite a range of scientific publications, particularly on fire history, fire behavior, fire ecology, and fire management. Some of these no longer exist because the last copy that I had went up in the fire in 1918 or 2018. I also worked for Pacific Gas and Electric as a vegetation management data analysis and the director of the Sierra Energy Center, which was the first rural energy efficiency center in the country. The only reason I mention PG&E is because they started the campfire. Their equipment started the campfire, so it's relevant in that sense. And I also lived in Paradise from the year 2000 to the year 2018. So that's a little background on me. And the first thing I really want to start with here is to talk about something that the fake news, lamestream media is trying to get you to believe, and that is that climate change is coming. Well, climate change is not coming. Climate change is already here, and it's impacting communities all over the country and all over the world in many ways. And whether it's catastrophic river flooding in places like Nashville, or it's damage from recurring droughts in places like eastern Colorado, or coastal flooding from storm surge in places like Engelhard, North Carolina, or devastation from Category 5 winds in places like Mexico Beach, or towns leveled by megafires in California. Climate change is already here, and it's already devastating communities around the world. And it's particularly impacting those people and those communities that are most vulnerable. But it's also creating entirely new populations of vulnerable people, just because of the way climate change is impacting our communities and the ways that our cultures and societies are not prepared to be resilient to those kinds of impacts and changes. So my presentation is specifically about Paradise, California. This sign used to be at the entrance to town in Paradise. And I want to give you a little context about where Paradise is, so you have a better understanding of the geography and the people there as we go into this. So forgive me while I give a little context and background. Geographically, Paradise was located about 3 hours north of San Francisco in Northern California. It was located in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains at elevations between 1,500 and 2,500 feet. It was on a ridge between two river canyons. Paradise and Magalia, which were two conjoined communities in the foothills, had a combined population of about 40,000 people. And it was about 30 minutes from the town of Chico, which is where Sierra Nevada Brewery started, and which is probably the main reason that we are here. Not that we're big Sierra Nevada Brewery fans, but we heard from people who'd been out here from Chico dealing with Sierra Nevada. They were like, oh yeah, it's really nice out there. So that's one reason why we ended up here. So Paradise was kind of a rural town in the mountains, pine oak forests, very beautiful, much cooler than the valley floor, just like it's cooler up here in the mountains than it is down in the upstate or in the Piedmont. So that's kind of where Paradise was located. Demographically, Paradise is very different in some ways than California as a whole. The first notable thing about Paradise is that it was much poorer than average than the rest of California. The median income in Paradise was about 2/3 of the state median income. So it was definitely overall a poor community. There were rich people in Paradise, but there was a lot of low-income people in Paradise. Also, Paradise was much older on average than California as a whole, with a median age of 49 compared to 30. And as you can see in this chart, a full third of the population in Paradise was over 60. And the last major demographic thing to understand was Paradise was much whiter than average for California. 88% of the residents of Paradise were white. The remaining 12% were mostly Hispanic, as compared to only 37% white for all of California. And when you talk to Paradisians about Paradise being old, white, and poor, they tend to get really upset because that's kind of a monolithic view. There were plenty of young families with small kids. There were 2 elementary schools, there was a middle school and a high school. There were a lot of families that lived in Paradise, and there were a lot of people who weren't lower income. But you know, if you had to say 3 words to describe Paradise, that would be fairly close. And my apologies to anybody from Paradise who might be listening, because I know they're mad at me now. So on November 8th, 2018, there was a fire, the Camp Fire, that completely wiped the town off the map. And so what I'm going to be talking about is a tiny bit about the fire, but a lot about the impacts of the fire on the town and the people of the town and what happened to them, and how these kind of impacts happen in all sorts of climate driven disasters and just climate change impacts overall. So the Camp Fire, as it was called, it was started on Camp Creek Road. It wasn't started by a campfire. Was caused by the failure of a hook on a high voltage power line owned by PG&E. The fire started at 6:15 in the morning in the community of Pulga. It's not really a community, it's a spot on the road. And it was driven downhill to the west, to the southwest, by downslope winds that occur often in the fall in that area, like the Santa Ana winds in Southern California. These were 40 to 50 mile an hour winds, very dry conditions, very breezy conditions. By 8 o'clock, the fire had reached the outskirts of Paradise and had completely blown over the community of Concow. By 10:45, about a third of the town was devastated, and about half the roads were blocked due to the fire, so there were very few evacuation routes. I was somewhere about where the E in Paradise is on this map at that point in time. By 6 p.m., the entire town had been consumed, and the fire was advancing on the city of Chico by that point. So the fire, this was literally the most devastating fire in California history, and completely wiped the town off the map. In the end, the Camp Fire was 153,000 acres. 85 people actually died in the fire. Many others died because of impacts of the fire, but didn't die actually in the fire. 14,000 homes were destroyed, and the financial cost is, to date, somewhere between $55 and $100 billion when you add it up, all up together. So just to give you an idea of how big the Camp Fire really was, I thought I'd overlay it on a map of the Asheville area. And you can see that the fire stretched from Swannanoa to Canton and from Weaverville down to Fletcher. So this was a large fire. It wasn't even by a long shot the biggest fire in California that summer or that year. There were a couple other fires that were actually bigger than the Camp Fire. But as you can see, it was a very large fire. Certainly nothing in this area would ever compare to that. So people say, you know, oh, California has fires all the time. How do we know if climate change contributed? And climate change did contribute. And there's some very, very clear ways to see how it did that. So I'll talk about those briefly as well. This graph here has got a lot of colored dots on it. Hopefully your screen's in color. But it shows by 20-year periods the average precipitation during the fire season, May to November, and that's on the vertical axis. And the horizontal axis shows the average maximum temperature. So the upper left corner is cool and wet, lower right corner is hot and dry. You can see the blue dots are the 1900s and 19-teens, and the red dots are the 2000s to 2019. And you can see that the area has gotten significantly warmer and drier in that period. And in this period here, 2018 was the hottest fire season on record. So that's one thing. We can see that climate change's footprints in that. We can also see it in the rise in nighttime temperatures. And the reason why that's important is back when I was a firefighter in the 80s, and we counted on fires laying down at night, that the behavior would moderate, the humidities would come up, but we're not seeing that anymore now. The fire behavior is sometimes just as extreme at night as it is in the daytime. The Tubbs fire, which burned a big part of the city of Santa Rosa in 2017, actually started at 2 in the morning. And those people had to evacuate in the middle of the night. So that's a contributing factor. And the other thing that we're noticing is that the rainy season is shifting. California's precipitation is highly seasonal, unlike here where it rains every day, almost every day. In California, most of the rain comes between October and April or May. But that's now starting to shift where the rains are coming later, but they're still dying out by May or June. And so that creates longer, drier fire seasons. We're now seeing fires later in the year. In 2016-17, the Thomas fire actually occurred over Christmas. So now California has a year-round fire season, which never would have been unheard of back when I was a firefighter. So how has climate change made fires worse in California? Well, the short answer is they're bigger. The big fires are bigger, and the destructive fires are more destructive. And you can actually see that in this chart here, which shows the size of the biggest fire in every year since 1900. So in 1932, the biggest fire was about 220,000 acres. It's the biggest. It's not all the acres burned, it's just the most extreme event. And what we see since around 2000 is the most extreme events are getting more extreme, in some cases way more extreme than they had been for an entire century. So that's really the impacts. And what we're seeing is since 2003, 15 of the 20 largest fires in California history have occurred since in the past 17 years. 10 of the 20 deadliest fires in California history have occurred in the past 17 years. And 9 of the 10 most destructive fires, as far as structures destroyed, have occurred since 2017. I think it's fairly undeniable that these are the consequences of climate change in California, and it's only going to continue and get worse. As far as the impacts of on the town of Paradise, 52,000 people were forced to evacuate on November 8th. Most of those people lost their homes. 90% of the homes in Paradise were destroyed. And the ones that were left standing were unoccupiable for 6 to 12 months. So those people just didn't go home on November 9th. They were not able to go home for a long period of time. And some of them still haven't, even though their homes are still standing. Toxic debris polluted the soil and groundwater. They removed 3.7 million tons of debris from Paradise, from destroyed houses and buildings. Over 1 million trees were killed. Like I said, it was a pine oak forest, and most of the trees, certainly all the trees on our property, were destroyed. Paradise was the largest city west of the Mississippi that was entirely based on septic, and because the houses burned down and there was no water, the septic systems all dried up, and 80% of the septic systems were damaged. And that's a big barrier to anybody moving back in, as they almost certainly have to have their septic system replaced. Certainly that was the case on our property. We had 2 different people go out and check the system, and they both said, nope, it's leaking. You have to have it replaced. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, the entire water system was contaminated with toxic benzene due to the depressurization of the water system, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars to repair and prevented anybody from using the water in their homes for months and months, for about a year, actually. So that's bad enough, but let's talk a little bit about vulnerable communities in Paradise and the impacts on them and why they were impacted more. In Paradise, the vulnerable communities were primarily the elderly and disabled, low-income residents, and minorities, particularly non-English speakers. And I'm going to go over each of these a little bit and how they were impacted. The impacts on the elderly were particularly noticeable because 86% of the fatalities from the fire were people over 60. The median fatality age was 72, and the median age in Paradise was 49. So the people who died were significantly older, which kind of reminds us of the coronavirus a little bit. But why did older people tend to die more in the campfire? Obviously, it's not a disease, so different impacts. And there's a bunch of reasons, actually. Many old elderly people in Paradise lived alone. They didn't have close families or friends. They didn't have anybody to help them or to notify them or to help them get out of town. Many had physical disabilities that limited mobility. They couldn't move around very well, so they had a hard time evacuating. Many of them actually lacked transportation. My wife can tell you, there was this little old woman with a little shopping cart. She used to pull over to the Safeway grocery store every week. She didn't have a car, and she would take that. Some people took a taxi to the grocery store because they couldn't drive anymore. A lot of the older people in Paradise lacked access to technology for notifications, whether that was internet access, Wi-Fi, cell phones, cable TV. A lot of people just lived in their trailer and had, rabbit ears, getting 1 or 2 channels, and they didn't have any idea what was going on until it was too late. And some elderly people suffered cognitive issues that prevented clear action. There's definitely been some stories about people who were very confused by what was going on and weren't able to evacuate. So a lot of impacts there. On low-income residents, they were impacted more for also a variety of reasons, different reasons than the ones that impacted some of the elderly. They tended to live in older, less fireproofed homes that maybe had been in their family for 2 or 3 generations, were completely paid for, and but were not particularly fireproof. They lived in the trees like everybody did. They didn't have the resources to be prepared. They may not have had go bags or have copies of all their documentation stored in Dropbox or something like that, or have the money to get the trees and brush cleared off of their property. So they were not as prepared to deal with either surviving a fire or the impacts of a fire. The low-income residents were more likely to rent than own, so they had less control over their property to keep it clear, to keep it safe. They may have only lived in a trailer on a rented lot. Many of them, because they didn't own, did not have homeowners insurance. And so when they lost everything, it was just gone. There was no way for them to recover to get any of their things back. Some lacked reliable transportation, excuse me. And many of them lacked money to afford temporary housing. When 52,000 people evacuate a town, they have to go somewhere. And as we'll talk about in a minute, every hotel within 90 miles was completely full. So where did they go? They didn't have money for hotel rooms. And if they didn't have insurance, they certainly didn't have the money to rebuild. So that put them at a much greater disadvantage for being resilient and recovering from this disaster than people with greater means, obviously. Many of them lacked access to physical and mental health services. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as one of the main impacts of the fire. And honestly, limited education and among all the residents, including myself, may have impeded the understanding of complex aid processes. They set up a disaster recovery center, DRC, that had everybody. It had SBA and FEMA and the Department of Motor Vehicles, everybody. I mean, 100 different agencies in there, but they all had huge forms to fill out. Just to get our water turned off, we had to fill out a massive form to do that. And so understanding these forms and processes and what you qualified for was very difficult, and particularly harder for people who had less levels of education or literacy. So that definitely put those people at a disadvantage. And as far as minorities, even though they were an actual real minority in Paradise, one of the things that really stunned me was how few accommodations were made for them, particularly for Spanish-speaking residents of the area. The emergency communications were almost totally in English only. The evacuation orders were in English. The road closure orders were in English. Most of the emergency shelters were in English. There were some Spanish language accommodations provided, but it wasn't as much as you would think in a state like California. Part of it is that part of the state is very white. And so people don't necessarily think of the needs of non-English speakers. And certainly a lot of the recovery related resources, some of these little agencies like the Paradise Water Irrigation District and things like that, they didn't have their materials in Spanish. So the Spanish speaking residents there had problems dealing with some of the charities that were providing food and clothing and shelter. They didn't always have Spanish language resources. Certainly some of the financial resources, even some of the FEMA stuff, they did have things in Spanish, but not everything. And as far as things like after the fire, the PG&E lawsuit that is currently ongoing, I haven't seen anything in Spanish. I haven't been particularly looking for it, but it's not like the lawyers are putting out, here's all of our stuff in Espanol. I haven't seen any of that. So that's really disadvantaged them. And they may have no idea of a lot of things that are going on or resources that are even available to them after the fire because they're not in their native language. And on top of that, non-citizens, even if they're legal residents, aren't eligible for many types of relief and aid programs. Certain FEMA programs and like SBA loans are not available to people who are not US citizens, even if they're here legally. So those kind of things impacted those sort of vulnerable groups more than they may have impacted others. And one of the other things, I'll just go over this real quickly. FEMA set aside some 33 disaster case managers to help these people navigate their way through these various processes and all the paperwork and everything. But those 33 case managers were only able to handle about 870 households at a time. And that's 27 households per case manager, which means you're not getting very much attention from that person, right? But even with that, they had 3 times as many households on the waiting list. So just to get help with these kind of problems and navigating the paperwork and all that stuff, there was just such a backlog because the resources just weren't there for those people. So that's very quickly, and I know I'm blowing through a lot of stuff really fast, and I apologize. This originally was a 2-hour presentation, so I'm trying to kind of keep it down a little bit. So that's a little bit about vulnerable communities, but one of the things I really want to talk about is how the campfire made everyone vulnerable and how climate change disasters and just climate change in general makes everyone vulnerable because our communities and society are not adapted or resilient to these kinds of changes. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And the big one is housing. So I want to spend a little time on housing and its impact on people. On the day of the fire, 52,000 people evacuated Paradise. In the middle of November in Sacramento, which is about an hour and a half from Paradise, the typical hotel occupancy rate, about 44%. After the fire, the occupancy rate was 99.4%, which meant for every 1,000 hotel rooms, only 6 were empty. And that created a lot of impacts on people and made it very difficult for people to find temporary shelter. There were 11 actual shelters opened up after the fire, and about 10% of Paradisians ended up staying in those shelters. You can see it's just people sleeping on cots. They did have a norovirus outbreak at one of the shelters. It was big news for a couple of weeks. A lot of people got sick with the norovirus, which is very nasty. And as you can imagine with the coronavirus, similar situations, whether it was a fire, evacuation from a fire or a hurricane, would be highly problematic in these days. A lot of people who didn't have insurance or couldn't find a hotel room or couldn't find a spot in the full shelters really had no choice. They became instantly homeless. We were all homeless, but some of us at least had a roof. And what happened was a lot of people ended up living in the Walmart parking lot in Chico. Unbeknownst to anybody, the Walmart parking lot was everybody's meetup place when there was a disaster. Nobody knew that this was going to be a thing, but everybody said, yeah, we'll meet at Walmart. And so everybody met there and stayed there for weeks. So hundreds of people just camped there, became instantly homeless, and started to build a community there because they had no money or nowhere else to go. As you can imagine, having that many people suddenly leave one town and have to go somewhere else had a lot of impacts for the town of Chico, which was the nearest town 30 minutes away. Chico added 20,000 residents overnight, which was 20 years of population growth in a matter of hours. And it had a lot of impacts. It increased car crashes, robberies, assaults, water use. And it actually strained the sewage system because it wasn't built to accommodate that many people. So that had a lot of impacts just on the neighboring town as these refugees started to spread out. But it also had big impacts on the housing market. Almost overnight, the housing market in Chico became the hottest housing market in the country. Prices increased by 44% overnight to the median. So the median home price went from about $300,000 to $440,000 almost overnight. We knew people who actually went out and bought a house the day after the fire. And we were like, well, that's crazy. But people did it because they needed a place to live. And those impacts lasted for over a year on the area and made it very difficult for people to recover. All of this led up to climate change refugeeism, which virtually includes everyone in Paradise, because to date, only 330 homes out of 14,000 have been rebuilt in Paradise. Paradise is not there anymore. There are some buildings, but the town essentially is gone, and the people are all somewhere else. And the question is, where did they all go? Well, as of a year ago, 45% of the people in Paradise had left Butte County, the county that Paradise was in, for somewhere else. Now, I'm sure that proportion is much higher now. And that had impacts on the population of Butte County. Butte County actually lost 10,000 people in a one-year period. And you go, oh, well, okay, I get that. But that also has a big impacts on the county, because fewer people means fewer funds, state and federal funds for roads and transportation, schools, mental health services, homelessness. So even though there was a lot of people from Paradise staying in Butte County, there was less money to help deal with the needs that those people had. As far as where people went, they went everywhere. A lot of them stayed local. You can see a lot of them stayed in Northern California, but you can also see that Henderson County got a couple of people. So people went everywhere. There was quite the diaspora. And of course, these numbers are almost a year old, so I haven't gotten new numbers. So I'm sure that there's been a wider spread of people after the fire. And this impacts communities everywhere. Not just where the disaster happens, but communities all over the West in this particular case, or all over the country. And of course, whenever there's refugeeism, there's an increase in homelessness. And in a March 2019 Butte County survey, there's over 100% increase in homelessness in Butte County, even though almost half of the people in the campfire had left Butte County. There has been 100% increase in homelessness there. And the homelessness is persistent. This image was taken in January of a homeless camp in Magalia, which is just up the hill from Paradise. And the Magalia Community Church did a survey of the homeless there, and they found 1,000 families living in RVs or trailers, sharing homes with families or friends, living in carts, cars or tents, or in temporary FEMA housing. All the FEMA housing is now gone. I think that closed in August. And so now we have permanent homeless communities because of this, and these people have just had no way to recover from that. As a result, there were some severe physical and mental health impacts on the citizens of Paradise and the surrounding areas caused by the fire. Some of the health issues, tens of thousands of people were trapped, as I was, in the fire, escaping the fire. So untold thousands of people suffer PTSD from escaping the fire. The older population there already had instances of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, mental health issues, etc. The only hospital in town was damaged and is closed. Most of the healthcare providers lost their offices and businesses up there. So those people were not able to provide care. I lost a doctor up there. I mean, he didn't die, he lost his business, and God only knows where he is. And so as a result, many fire survivors lost contact with the healthcare system and were not able to get healthcare, and now are dealing with months or years of unmanaged physical and mental health issues, which are only compounding the problems they're having with housing and things like that. Mental health services in Butte County went up in a year after the fire. They'd gone up by 60%, even though they had lost half of their previous clients. they had had a 60% increase in the total number of clients that seeking mental health services with the county. So these were some of the really horrible impacts that happened to people because of the fire. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about insurance, which is nothing like mental health issues, but dealing with insurance is actually one of the most traumatic things that people have to deal with after the fire. And I just want to show you how the system is not really set up to accommodate or help people. And I know insurance is boring and all that, but it's actually a very important thing to talk about, because I had so many people say to me, well, you had insurance, so it's all okay, right? You just lost some stuff. And that's not true. Even though you get it, yep, it's not going to rebuild, put everything back the way it was. It doesn't do anything close to that. Most survivors will spend 2 years or more dealing with their insurance company. People from the 2017 fires are still dealing with their insurers 3 years later. And in Paradise, only 330 homes have been rebuilt 2 years after the fire. So that's still almost 14,000 homes that need to be rebuilt to get back to where they were. 73% of fires, there was a group that did a survey of campfire survivors, and 73% of fires were either underinsured or uninsured. A full 32%, a third of people had no insurance at all. Those people just lost everything and got nothing to get their lives back in order. But even the people who were fully insured, the 27%, were not guaranteed to get everything or even close to everything they're owed to help them recover from the fire. And I apologize for this, but I'm going to give 2 examples of how insurance is not designed to help you recover. It doesn't actually help you recover. So I'm going to go through this one really quick. So bear with me, it's numbers, but I think it's important to understand how the system really works, because we went through this and became kind of insurance experts and came out the other end going, it's not really designed to help us, is it? So this is an example using a fully insured homeowner planning to relocate. California allows you to relocate. Not every state does. Some states say you have to rebuild on the same location. Well, Paradise is gone, so there's no point in rebuilding there. So we were planning to relocate, and these numbers are roughly based on our experience. So in insurance, I'm not going to spend any time on this. You get a bunch of different kinds of coverages. Coverage A is your house, the building, not the stuff in it, not anything else, just the house itself. So let's say you had $300,000 in insurance on your house. Almost all insurance policies come with what they call extended replacement costs. This is an inflation adjustment for if it costs more to rebuild your home or relocate than you had on your insurance. So you get an extra 50% buffer. That's great, sounds great. So your total coverage is $450,000. So let's see how much of that you actually get. So they're going to appraise your home, the insurance company, and they come back and say, well, your home was only worth $400,000. So we'll give you the $300,000 for your coverage, but we're going to take $50,000 off of the extended replacement cost because the house wasn't worth $450,000 according to what we say. Okay, so that's, you're like, okay, there's still $400,000. If you have a mortgage, that $300,000 in cash goes to the bank, not to you, and they take their money out. If, similar to us, you had about $180,000 mortgage, that money you never see. So the cash that you actually get to replace your home is only $120,000. But you still have that $100,000 in extended replacement costs, so that's going to help. Except insurance companies play a lot of games as far as how they use that. Our insurance company, not everyone does this, but ours said, you're buying a different piece of land. We don't insure land. We don't pay for land. So they subtract the value of the land for your new home. And then if your new home happens to be nicer than your old home, they deduct things for like, oh, you have real hardwood floors in your new home compared to laminate. We'll deduct for that. You had newer carpet in your new home instead of the old carpet in your own home. We'll deduct for that. And in the end, you often end up with nothing from your extended replacement costs. So the bottom line is from $450,000 of insurance, you actually only get $120,000 to replace your home. And remember I said the median price of a home in that area in Butte County went to $440,000 after the fire? Well, you had $450,000 in insurance, but you only get $120,000. So you end up $320,000 short of what you would need to actually replace your home. And that makes it almost impossible, particularly for people who lost their businesses, their jobs in Paradise. They don't have jobs anymore. So how are they supposed to come up, be able to take out a mortgage for $320,000 to buy a new home? So that's one example of how the system really doesn't work to help you recover. I'm going to do another one really quick because I'm starting to run out of time here. And that is additional living expenses. And I know this insurance stuff is really boring, but it's very important to understand because it really does impact your ability to be resilient and to recover from these kinds of events. Additional living expenses, it's usually called ALE, not AL, is all the extra expenses that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't lost your house. You had to stay in a hotel, the insurance pays that. You had to eat at restaurants, the insurance pays that. You have a longer commute because you're now staying an hour and a half away from where you used to live. The insurance company pays that. And it's usually 2 or 3 years, depends on the state law. And it's typically 15 to 20% of the amount of coverage you have for your structure, for your house. So let's do a quick example here. If you had $300,000 in coverage on your house, 15% of that's $45,000. Seems like a lot of money for hotels and eating out. And you have 2 years to spend that. But when you do the math, and this is based on not our numbers, but on people that we knew, if you stayed in a hotel in Redding for 6 months, which there may still be people living in hotels 20 months after the fire now, probably not many, but there may still be a few people staying in hotels. At $100 a day, pretty average price in California, that's $18,000. For 2 people to eat out every meal, every day for 6 months, $50 a person, pretty typical in California, that's another $18,000. The fact that you have to now commute 90 minutes rather than 20 minutes to work, that adds up to another $8,300. And so in 6 months period, you've spent virtually the entire $45,000 in ALE that your insurance company had set aside for you. So that isn't going to help you when there's people from the 2017 fires who still haven't been able to rebuild 3 years later. And so what happens to those people who run out of ALE? This actually happened to the people in the 2017 fire. They had 2 years of ALE. Well, the insurance company shows up and they take all the furniture and all the household goods, the plates, the forks, the coffee maker, the stove, the washing machine, everything. And then they tell you, you have to pay rent from now on. So this has actually happened to people from the 2017 fires. So these people may be forced to find whatever permanent housing they can as soon as they can. They may have to leave the area to find affordable housing that they can afford because they no longer have an insurance coverage. Or they may become homeless because they just have no way to pay for anything or any housing whatsoever. So these are the kinds of impacts that people suffered from the Camp Fire. They suffered them from Hurricane Michael in Mexico Beach, Florida, in Puerto Rico, everywhere that these kinds of things are happening. These people have suffered these consequences. So the things that I really want you to take away from this talk is that climate change does disproportionately impact vulnerable communities, but it also creates entirely new vulnerable communities. Even people like me and my wife who were relatively well off. Our life was totally destroyed. We were very lucky that we were able to start over, but so many people in similar situations to us have not been able to start over. And really the takeaway is there's no recovery from climate change. There's no getting back to normal. There's maybe a new normal at some point, but it isn't the same. There's no going back. Climate change permanently changes the nature of the landscape and your relationship to it. So what next? Well, this is where I have like 2 minutes left. So it's a whole separate presentation to talk about this. But what we really have to do is look at things a little differently. The first thing we have to do is accept that we can't stop climate change. It's already here. If we stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, it would still be a couple of decades before all the carbon that we've put in the atmosphere has generated the effects that it's going to generate. So it's here, and we have to deal with it even if we swore off fossil fuels tomorrow. We have to deal with that. So it's here. So since it's here, we have to adapt by building resilient communities and resilient cultures. And again, that's a whole separate presentation that I don't have time to do today. It would be a great one to talk about because there's a lot of things that communities can and need to do. We've started having some of those conversations with Black Lives Matter because people are starting to think about it. But we really have to start making some fundamental changes to the way that our relationship to our communities and our planet. So I'm going to list these real fast, and then I'm going to be done and take questions. Elements of resilience include adaptability, and I'm getting dry mouth here. Adaptability, the ability to change and adjust to impacts, whether it's the changing climate or whatever. Self-sufficiency and self-reliance, being a communities more reliant on their own local sources, it helps make them more resilient. Sustainability, moving away from unsustainable practices, fuels, things like that, farming. A greater emphasis on diversity, not just racial diversity, but cultural diversity, economic diversity in that. Greater participation. People are going to need to participate more in their communities in order to have a more sustainable and resilient society. And we need more durable and redundant infrastructures, whether that's transportation, dams, roads, whatever that is, supply chains, more durable and redundant, as well as being sustainable, diverse, and self-sufficient in order to have more resilient communities that are going to be able to deal better with the impacts of climate change as they come over the coming decades. So I know that was a lot of material. I appreciate your patience. Hopefully there are still people watching. Looks like we only lost one person. And so I want to thank you, and I'll open it up to questions. I think Susan's going to handle the questions and relay them to me.
Yeah, so we've got one question already, Tony. And this, Steve has asked you to comment on how the insurance companies operate during a disaster involving many people and millions of dollars versus the isolated incident of, say, a house fire. Do all insurance companies in all circumstances operate in the same way?
That's a great question. So we'll take about 2 more hours and I'll go over all the details of how that is. The bottom line with insurance companies is their mindset is your house burned down, okay? Your house burned down, not your entire town. So their mindset is your house burned down, housing prices are stable, you love your neighborhood, it's still there, your job's still there, your neighbors are still there, the school's still there, everything's still there, just your house burned down. So we want you to rebuild where you love to live, your house. Their mindset is, yeah, they hate the idea that this impacted more than just you, because they don't want you to do anything to rebuild. This is really hammered into their mindset. They want you to rebuild. Even in California, where it's absolutely legal to go somewhere else and buy a new home, they don't want you to do that, and they don't like it. The other thing that they're not prepared for is the scope. We had an experience with our insurance company nationwide. Not going to keep them anonymous. They deserve every call out that they get because they're so horrible. In June of 2019, they told us, we asked them a lot of questions about relocating and what they're going to do and their policies. And these are policies that aren't in your policy. These are policies that are in some secret policy guide that they have. Your policy doesn't never mention any of this stuff. But we asked them a whole bunch of questions. They said, we're going to have a big corporate phone call that you're not invited to talk about your case. And so they had this phone call, and then everybody with Nationwide that were on the Nationwide Facebook group and all that stuff, we're like, after that phone call that they never told us anything about, the answer to every claim was no, you get nothing. And they made the decision that they had spent enough money, this inference, they had spent enough money on this fire and they weren't going to spend any more. And so at that point, they told all their adjusters, don't give anybody any more money, find a way to deny it or run them through the mill. And so that just keep, obfuscating so that, it costs them money. you know, to insure all these houses and to have them all lost at the same time. They're not prepared for that. They're not resilient in the face of climate change. And so for them, they have a mindset problem, and they also have a financial problem. They have an incentive problem. You know, unlike a company like Apple, which says, you know, we'll sell you the cheap phone, but if you want all the cool stuff, you got to pay for it. But remember, you pay more, you get more. With the insurance company, they have a perverse incentive, which is we want you to pay premiums, but we don't want to give you any of that money back. That's not really part of our business model, is giving you money back. We make more money if we give you less product. Apple's motivation is we make more money if we give you more product. The insurance company is opposite. And so that needs to be dealt with. I will be absolutely honest, having been through this, insurance should be nationalized. Absolutely. I don't mind people going, oh, you're a socialist. I really don't care. Having been through this experience, there's no reason for insurance to be handled the way it is. It doesn't work. It doesn't help people.
All right, we've got another question in here, shifting from insurance a little bit. And you
Yep.
spoke to this some, but what should we be doing to prepare for more climate refugees?
Oh, well, a wall, big wall, a big, beautiful wall to keep them out. That hasn't been working so well. Yes, well, I think the answer is the same as what you need to be doing anyway, which is we need to be focusing on building more resilient communities, because climate refugeeism is going to become, I actually believe, I may be a little bit biased, I believe it is going to be one of the defining social issues of the 21st century. I mean, you know, there's plenty of discussion about how ISIS partly arose due to climate change in Syria and Iraq, and that the droughts there drove the extremism there. Certainly, the droughts that are happening in Central and South America that are changing the climates for like the coffee growers and things like that are driving people to come north to the United States. So there's really not going to be any stopping it. So we need to have communities that understand that you can't stop it. You have to find ways to accommodate it. Building a wall is not going to work for a variety of reasons. So you have to say, we need a community that's resilient enough that we can accommodate these climate refugees into and take advantage of their skills and abilities and integrate them into our communities.
Are there any other questions out there? We've got about 2 minutes.
2 minutes, look at that.
Yeah, good for you, Tony. So Tony, let me just take it for a second, because Mountain True and Conserving Carolina have both been working on what their programming does and how it relates to climate change. I'm very pleased of these two great nonprofits working in that direction, but you and I both have also joined up with some other folks locally, the Concerned Citizens for Climate Change. And can you just give us a brief shout out to those folks?
Yeah, so C4, as we called Concerned, I think we decided to change the name to Concerned Community with the Climate Crisis. I don't know, it's C4, it's four words with C's in it. Is a small local group here in Henderson County. And sadly, we've been fairly dormant since March because of the coronavirus. But this is a wonderful community group of people that are concerned with really the great thing about this group, I would say, you didn't prompt me on this, so I'm just going to say it, is that the diversity of approaches. My approach is really focused on resilience and adaptation, because I've seen climate change firsthand, and I'm like, yeah, okay, we can all drive Priuses, but it's already here. So that's great, and people should be doing that, and we should do everything we can on mitigation, but we also need to focus on adaptation. The thing that I like about C4 is that we have people thinking about resilience from a forest sustainability viewpoint, from a farming viewpoint. We have people looking at legislation as far as dealing with carbon issues. So it's a really wide range. There's really, and the group that I was kind of starting to work with was focused on climate education. So there really was a wide range of viewpoints and approaches. It's really kind of sad that we stopped being able to meet in person because a really good constructive group. I really want to see us get back to being able to do the things that we were doing. A really good group, and this group still exists in a virtual space. So do you remember the email address for C4? You, Katie?
Oh, good heavens. No, but we can certainly, if anybody's interested in joining us, and we're welcoming all kinds of folks who are concerned about the climate and want to take some action. It helps you feel better if you can at least get involved and do something. So
yes, I agree. If you are concerned with the climate crisis, what I would say is start somewhere and keep going. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, I recycle, and I won't get into what I think about recycling in North Carolina, but it's one thing to say, I recycle, I'm doing my part. And it's like, that's great. It is good that you do that, but don't stop there. Take the next step. Doesn't matter how small, just keep taking steps to address it. And whatever those are, I would say the main thing really to do is to get involved in your community somehow. Whether that's in planning, emergency management, or something, the city council, something, have a voice in how your communities are dealing with the climate crisis. Every community is going to be impacted, every single one, everywhere in the world. And so having a voice in that is, I think, the most important thing you can do.
great. Yes, indeed. All right. It's time for us to sign off.
All right.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Tony. And we hope that you will be back with us, everyone, next month to hear about South Wings and Hume Davenport. See you then.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tony.